The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to SageWorks webinar, Using Big Data for Firm Success. My name is Zach Meyer, and I'm the marketing manager here for ProfitCents. Before we start, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First item that I'd like to cover is that you are in listen-only mode. So what that means is you don't have to worry about any background noise or anything that could be going on around you. We can't hear anything on here, so you should only be able to hear the presenter. But that also means that if you have any questions, we can't hear your questions either. So if you go over to the GoToWebinar panel, you'll see an option that you can enter in your questions, and we will answer those either throughout or at the very end of the webinar presentation. If we do not have time to get to your questions, we'll follow up with an email, where we will also send you the slides and recordings from the webinar presentation. Additionally, we'll have polls throughout the webinar, and you're encouraged to participate in answering those because they can help guide the way that we present the material today. That way it can be most customized to your needs. And then finally, downloading in slides and recording, you would have been able to have that option if you look over in your questions box where we sent you a welcome message. There you'll be able to download the slides, and then we will also send you a recording to download later. Additionally, I'd like to introduce you to SageWorks and what we do. SageWorks is a financial information company that provides financial analysis solutions to accountants and financial institutions. SageWorks data and applications are used by thousands of accounting and financial institutions across North America, and SageWorks has been named to Incorporated 500 list of fast-growing privately held companies in the U.S., named to Deloitte's Technology Fast 500, and to NC Tech Awards Excellence in Customer Service. And finally, before we begin, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, D. Scott Showalter, who's a CPA, and he is also the professor of practice in the Department of Accounting at Poole College of Management at NC State University. Professor Showalter actively assists regulators and firms in the accounting industry to understand the nature of data analytics and how to apply concepts to meet their professional obligations. We're thankful for his excitement in leading this webinar, and he will take it over from here.
Thanks, Zach. Thank everybody for joining us today. I've designed today's webinar to first start out with what I'll call some basics, because I don't know where all of you are coming from, how much you know and much you don't. And as Zach mentioned, we have some polling questions. Hopefully that'll help us to direct where I go on this. And then I've included a couple examples of firms that I've worked with that are using data analytics and big data that I'll share with you. That will be helpful, I think, from that perspective. If you look at these 5 objectives I hope to cover today, one is data analytics. I've started, even though the session's called Big Data, we first have to kind of ground set with data analytics first, because big data is a type of data analytics. I want to talk a little bit about that, how data analytics and big data is currently being used, go to some emerging trends, which is really my examples I have for today. And out of those examples come some challenges that we have found as we try to implement these big data applications. So we'll talk about the challenges related to those 2 examples I've used. And then I'll look at my crystal ball a little bit and try to give you some ideas of what I see coming down the road. But as most of you probably know on this call, this is such an emerging area that it's anybody's guess where this is going to head. So thought I'd just first start off with a couple quotes to kind of refresh our memory on why we're even here. And you can see the quote here from the CEO of Google: every 2 days now we create as much information as we did at the dawn of civilization up to 2003. So the question comes up is the amount of data available to us has significantly increased, and our access, how we actually achieve it and use it, has also increased as well. I found this really cool picture. I was trying to get some information to try to highlight what's happening each day, and I think there's some really good, obviously I'm not going to cover each one of these, but I think there's some really good points here. So every minute of every day, there's 204 million email messages. I know some of you think you get every one of them every day, and I feel like that way as well. So we know there's a lot of email messages out there. Google receives over 2 million search inquiries every minute, and consumers spend over $272,000 every minute just online. So the question I have for you, as you're listening in on, is this audit evidence? can you use this information to help you conduct an audit in the various phases of the audit? And that's sort of what my challenge today is, to sort of tease that a little bit with you to see if we can come up with some examples of how this is actually audit evidence and how we can use this during the audit. So I'm going to start out with what is data analytics. Again, I'm starting with the broader concept of data analytics before I go into big data. And if you look in forms, they use a definition, the scientific process of transforming data into insights for making better decisions. So that's kind of a high level, but you can see it's about decision making, and this isn't reserved to audits, it's about companies in general, how they use it. Here at NC State, we do a lot of work with corporations related to data analytics and big data, and we have a lot of industry partners that work with us, and we've come up, the industry partners have actually come up with this definition, which I'll share with you. It's the mastery of analytical tools and the critical thinking skills to interpret, synthesize, adapt, convey, and apply the output of the tools to make sound business decisions that align with corporate goals, objectives, and strategies. Of course, you would expect an academic definition to be longer than the one in business, but I think you'll see some key points in that related to, it's just not about the tools, and I want to emphasize that several times. It's easy to get enamored about the technology, but actually the skills, particularly critical thinking, that's required to make this work is really important. And at the end of the day, it's just not about analysis for analysis' sake. It's about making decisions, whether those decisions are about business decisions or whether those decisions about whether a particular assertion's been met or disclosure is appropriate or you're doing a risk assessment. All that is what we're trying to do. Zach, I think at this point we have a polling question coming up.
That is correct. Our first polling question is, what is your current knowledge about data analytics? Option A is, I know the term, but I couldn't define it. B, I could describe it briefly in conversation. C, I consider myself an expert. Or D, this is the first time I'm learning about data analytics. Go ahead and answer these questions, and in a second we will let you know about the results. Hey, we have about 70% voted, and I'm going to go ahead and close down. So if you have any last second submissions, go ahead and do them. Alrighty, so the results for our first question, what is your current knowledge about data analytics, is 3% say, I know the term but couldn't define it, which is good news for us. 45% say, I could describe it briefly in conversation. 28% say, I consider myself an expert. And 24% say, this is the first time I'm learning about data analytics. Scott, is this what you were imagining?
Yeah, that was what I was sort of expecting, except we do have 28% ringers, so maybe we should have brought them involved in putting today's presentation on as well, and maybe they can add some questions along the way that will bring out some concepts here, Zach. But this is what I run across as I'm out dealing with businesses every day, is you get a variety, and as we go on today, you'll see maybe what you thought was data analytics is or is not, because it's a term that's broadly used and it covers a lot of different areas. But that's sort of what I expected. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is move a little bit about talking about data analytics and some concepts and terms before we get in. Again, this is kind of the level set part I'd like to do, just to make sure we're all on the same page, understanding some of the same items. Organizations have been using actually data for a little while to obtain insights that are not obvious before. And so whether it's a business been using, and businesses are probably ahead of audit firms, to be totally, at least my observation in this area is, and I'll get back to that whether you're having clients asking you about this or not. But clearly businesses have been in this area for a little while. Audit firms are beginning to get in this area, beginning to ask the questions. And because data analytics and big data actually changes the frame of business measurement and then how we will assure to that business. So there's clearly a change out here about, just to let everyone on this webinar know, it's such a change that here at NC State we're actually redesigning our curriculum, particularly our undergraduate curriculum, to make sure our students, no matter what major they're in, obviously accounting, but they could be finance, supply chain, HR, whatever it is graduating with a reasonable amount of data analytics experience, because we've been hearing so much from our industry partners how important this is. So one of the things that traditionally comes up is when you talk about data and data analytics, it's structured data, and I'm actually going to come back to an example of this later. But we're used to having structured data, things that fit nice. And if you had an access database and you were working with it, you had to get it lined up. You couldn't mix text with numeric, and you had to know the digits, and it had to be, if you messed it up, it was very hard to doing analysis with. So, and this is an area that data aggregators have made a living on for a very long time. It's taking a lot of information, putting it in a structured format, and then being able to do some type of analysis against it. So this historically is where we've been, is in the structured side. So what I'd like to kind of open your eyes up is to the unstructured side. And you'll see little icons on the screen. All these icons represent unstructured data. You'll also call it maybe unstructured text analysis is another thing. But all these things are either pictures or text, combination thereof, voice recordings, all different types of things. And all of these present an opportunity, and the technology under it makes it more accessible to us than it's ever been before. We have more capacity. Not only we can access it, we have, with the new tools, we can actually do something with it. It's one thing to have it, but another thing is how many rows on your Excel spreadsheet do you have that you can put this information in, or your Access database. So there's historically been limitations to how much you could actually handle, and that has pretty much gone away with big data. And actually, we can now do capabilities. We can do things with this unstructured data to provide insights in areas that we just couldn't do before. And again, I'm going to share some examples with that. But getting back to the capacity, I'll probably just be interesting. You know, we've all heard the word kilobyte and megabyte and gigabyte and terabyte. Those are the terms we hear, which means we're getting big. We're getting a lot of data. After terabyte, it's called petabyte. And a petabyte, to give you an idea how big that number is, it's a 1 followed by 15 zeros. So that tells you how much data. So instead of measuring things in megabyte and gigabyte and terabytes, when we get up to big data, we're going into petabytes. Here at NC State, literally every night we go online and we're doing research, solving business problems, and our files are in the petabyte size. And again, that deals with 1 followed by 15 zeros. But if you want to go up a little farther, there's exabyte, there's zettabyte, and my favorite, yottabyte, which sounds like Star Wars to me. But yottabyte, that's 1 followed by 24 zeros. So it gives you some idea of what the capacity issue and what that's going to be available to us. So with big data, some of the capacity issues to be able to do analysis is going away. And we think that's going to give us some insights we haven't had before. I ran across this picture actually over the weekend, and I wanted to do a little announcement. You'll see I gave a reference here. Accounting Horizons, probably no one on this webinar has probably heard of it, but the American Accounting Association, which is think of it, the trade organizations that academics belong to that teach accounting classes. It would be equivalent to the AICPA from that perspective. Has several journals, and this is a journal they just published in June. There are 9 articles in that journal on data analytics about auditing and financial reporting, and I would strongly recommend it to anyone that has responsibility in your firm to try to figure this out and try to figure out where to go to get this, because what this is, these articles, I read them all over the weekend. These are articles that are dealing with real-life examples of what's going on, and I've included in this webcast some of the items I saw in it, but it's just chock full of ideas. So I've encouraged you to do it. And this picture was one of the things that was in there, and I wanted to put this up to get you to start thinking about big data. And you'll see big data is big by size, but it's also about what it is. I mentioned earlier that the types of information that we look at significantly increases. So if you look here, you kind of start in the middle of this chart, and you'll see traditional data, and that's what we've been normally looking at. And you'll see it branches out up to the right, and we have scan data, web data, mobility data, which would be through phones. You'll see over on the left-hand side videos. You see down and below you see media recordings and those types of things. And so trying to get you to visualize by this picture is when we go into big data analysis, we now have some really powerful non-financial measures. And the question to us is, again, is this audit evidence? How can we use this during an audit to help us with the various assertions that we're putting forth? So I like that visual, and again, I do recommend highly the Accounting Horizons Academic Journal. I know it's not something you would normally look at, but those articles are pretty good. There's also some tools. I'll come back to tools later as well, but there's a variety of tools out here that are available, and this is just, by the way, there's a long, long list. I just picked some that I thought maybe you would recognize if you do anything in this area, but there's some of these tools you may be using, maybe some of them you haven't used, and some of them maybe you think you will never use. But what's interesting is these tools have allowed us, one, the capacity to do things that we haven't been able to do before. Two is they allow us the analysis. They've become very user-friendly. That's the other thing. If you haven't been to these tools recently, I encourage you to go in and look at them. One of the things we're doing in NC State here is we've had faculty that got their PhD 15, 20 years ago, and they used a lot of these tools. But they have significantly improved not only their capability, but their user interfaces. And so strongly, what I'm telling you is we're using this to teach students this information. So you should even be able to understand how to use the software as well. It's become very user-friendly from that perspective. And so it helps us capture data. The other thing it helps is visualization. You can get quickly overloaded with data in this process, and how do you show it and display it in such a way that makes sense? So there's a series of visualization software that goes with this as well. I mentioned Excel earlier, so I'd like to put a plug back in for that for you. Is that Excel 2013, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but 2013 has some pretty good data analysis and visualization capabilities in it. So they significantly increased their capacity, but also the capability. And so a lot of people have that, so that's another tool that you may have that would be helpful to you. It's real important to talk about skills here, and I mentioned earlier when I had the definition that it's just not about the technology. And that's what we do a lot here at NC State when we work with our students, but also what I work with when I work with businesses. We actually spend time training them on the skills that are necessary. And I like to sort of put them in two buckets. There's the hard skills, and there's the soft skills. And the hard skills is stats. You don't have to be a statistician, but you need, particularly to use some of these tools I just showed you, you need to be able to understand some of the pre-coded routines that are in it. So if you don't understand some of those, it could be a little tricky on the back end. So that you need some information about stats, but you don't have to be a statistician. You need to understand the tools, how they work the tools, but again, they're pretty intuitive, and as I say, even I can use them, so that ought to tell you that you can use them as well. The methodologies, I'm running into more and more firms that are using regression analysis and things like that you probably learned in college and decided you hope you never see again, but people are picking those up again and beginning to use those in some of the analysis. And that's sort of what I mean by the hard skills. These are kind of skills that we can teach. But the soft skills we are finding are just equally important, if not more importantly. And the first one is actually critical thinking. I know that's an overused term these days, but the ability to be able to think about what you're looking at, the ability to ask the right question. What is it I'm trying to solve? I know you say, well, I'm trying to determine the existence, assertion, or whatever related to inventory, but the question is, what's the question you need to ask in data analytics to be able to answer that question? So being able to, and then when you get the results, trying to sort out what you're looking at. You will get a lot of results, which I'll talk about later in the challenges. The question is how you're going to sort out where the potential errors will be. And so also knowing where to go look for data. If you go back to that picture I had up of unstructured data, you saw there was a lot of locations on there. Where do you want to go look? And that's just the beginning. There's a lot of publicly available information. In the work that we do, the federal government is just full of economic data and other types of things that we use that, again, I'll share with you later in that area. But there's a lot of information. You got to think about where the sources are. Dealing with ambiguity. This is an area that big data, it's not black and white, it's definitely gray. And so just being comfortable with things aren't quite as neat as you would like for them to be is really a key item. And I also put IT capabilities because, and you'll understand this later when I talk about the example, but the importance to be able to get the information from your client in a IT format becomes very important when you go do data analytics. So, you know, as far as skills, I got another quote here. The McKinsey Global Institute forecasts that 50 to 60% of the gap between the supply and demand of people with deep analytical talent. So there's going to be a big gap between, these are what you call the data geeks. And that's not really what I'm talking about today, but I just want to let you know that they're manufacturing a lot of these data geeks out here, or quants if you call them that. And the study projects there will be approximately 140 to 190 unfilled positions by 2018. But this is the part that relates to us. And there will be a shortage of 150 million managers and analysts who have the ability to understand and make decisions from big data. One of the things I hear constantly when I talk with businesses is the fact I got all this data and I got all these quant people wanting me data, but I don't know what to do with it. And so there's a big gap in getting the data and understanding what it means. And so that's, again, what we're trying to do here is help train people what to do with that. Okay. So this is a kind of rhetorical question. Obviously, you can't answer it because we have you on listen mode only, but think about it yourself. Do you know how your clients are using data analytics? Have they talked to you about it? Have they asked you, are you using data analytics? Someone may want to text us back on that if you have anything you want to share with us on that, and maybe Zach can share that with you. But you know, one of the things I run across a lot in talking to, again, the firms that are out here trying to figure out how to use this is that their clients are coming to them because they're using data analytics and asking for ways to say, how are you using it? And I've also had examples of proposals where audits have gone out for proposals, and one of the criteria now being asked is how are you using data analytics in delivering the audit service? And yes, there's probably some cost driven to that. There's definitely an efficiency reason I think they're asking that question, but I think there's also an effective, when you talk to audit committees and management about that, I think there's also an effectiveness, understanding that the world is changing significantly and realizing this may be a tool that can have a more efficient and effective audit, I think is one of the areas that they're asking. So if your clients haven't asked, don't be surprised if any day you get that question. Hopefully after this webinar, you'll be in a better position to be able to answer, at least have a dialogue with your client about it. So I thought it'd be relevant to just talk about, you're already doing some of this. So let's just think about currently doing it before we go to the next angle, which is how do we do more of it? And so the question is, how do you leverage the skills and experiences you have today with where this is going? And I think, Zach, at this point, I think we have another polling question coming up.
Absolutely. Our second poll question is, does your firm currently use some type of data analytics in conducting F&S audits? Yes, no, or not sure? Also, if anybody wants to send in any questions, you can still do that throughout the entire webinar. We've had a few come in, but we'd appreciate some more if you have any. All right, we're about at 70%. I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll and share the results. We have 33% saying yes, that their firm does use some type of data analytics in conducting F&S audits. 41% no, and 26% not sure. Does this surprise you at all?
Actually, it will be interesting how the 33% were aligned up with the first group that talked about they had experience in this. I bet you there's a big correlation there between those two numbers. But I would assume that the ones that are not sure would probably go in the no category. So no, I would. This is pretty much what I expected, and it's probably why people called into today's webcast. But again, it goes back to my earlier comment. You're already probably doing some of this. The question is, how do you take what you're doing and take it to the next level? And so it's not throwing out what you're doing. It's an and, it's not an or. That would be my kind of my message on that. So thanks for that input. Again, for those of you that said yes, if you could send us a text in to how you're doing it, maybe we could share that later. That'd be cool. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is actually kind of walk through some of the ways that we're using this, again, to try to so we can get some understanding. And we use analytical procedures a lot. Okay, it's required in two places, at the initial risk assessment and at the conclusion. and we can optionally do it in between and to the extent we need substantive audit evidence. And so you find, I mentioned earlier regressions, people may be doing regressions in the analytical procedures, maybe some benchmarking, maybe some vertical analysis where you're looking at the relationship between accounts and they expecting them to behave in certain ways. All that is analytical procedures, and all that's data analysis, and probably most of it is probably financial. And not that it has to be. You could include non-financial information in there, but my experience has been often that has been mainly focused on financial information. So as I said earlier, one thing that big data does is allows us to bring in non-financial information more readily into this conversation. So we're already there, and this will be interesting because I'm going to talk later about the standard setters, and we'll see how this relates into standard setter. What we've used to date probably is structured. That's because a lot of the tools we were using or we had at our disposal basically required us to have structured data, and since it required us to have it, that was what we looked at. And so when I talk about structured data, I just put some examples together so we're all on the same page when I talk about structured, that we know what we're talking about. These are examples: account codes. It could be account codes, it could be purchase order numbers, check numbers, shipping reports, whatever, but things that are standard that we know what to expect is in them. Sometimes it's doesn't have a name, but it has spaces. So everybody should recognize those X's as the Social Security number. And so sometimes we access data not because it's in a code, because of the way it's formatted. If we have data that's consistently formatted in such a way, sometimes we can access, and that's still structured data. Relational databases, ERP systems, spreadsheets, historically have all required us to put it in structured format before we could use it. And I just thought, since we're talking about auditing here, that our own clarified audit standards, the AUCs, that codification is an example of structured data. We have a code section, and we know where to go find it. And we can do searches around those codes. Yeah, you can do some data searches as well. But most of that is structured because we put in a word and we want it to go find the word. Boolean search is a little more, that maybe allows us to go on both sides of it a little bit, but still I would put that more in the structured side than that. And XBRL is an experiment that's been going on for the last 15 years or more. Public companies now are required to file under it. Some of the federal regulators require businesses to submit their information using XBRL, but it is a structured format. And one of the issues is the companies are spending a lot of money formatting the data into a structured format, which is XBRL. And my personal bias there, and even though the federal government currently under the Data Act is spending a lot of money to transform their data into structured systems, if big data and unstructured text analysis takes off, XBRL may be less than a dust one of these days. But anyway, just a personal bias I have. But with that, Zach, I think we actually have another polling question.
You're right, we sure do. All right, our third polling question is, what type of data analytics techniques have you used? Structured, unstructured, or our firm has not used any? Currently at 50%, and we're just waiting to get to 70% of answers. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down the last few seconds to answer. All right, so 54% say that they have used structured data analytics techniques, 12% unstructured data analytics techniques, and 35% say that they have not used any. Scott, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's what I totally expected. I kind of hinted to that as we went into this. My experience has been, as well as other firms that I work with, is they've been primarily focused on the structured side of this. So that's, to some extent, where the software has sent us, but that part is opening up now, and it's what we're comfortable with. But as I said earlier, one of the key skills we need is to get a little more comfortable with ambiguity. So thank you. Again, if anybody has some examples they want to send in where you use unstructured, please send those in so we can bring them up towards the end. So what is big data? What is big data? There's not one definition. I went to I went out to find a definition because I feel like I'd need to have a definition, but there's many definitions of big data. And usually you find it somewhere around amount, so the volume of data, just the sheer amount of data usually gets wrapped into big data. The fact that you go to non-traditional sources and go to all, again, the earlier picture I showed you of unstructured data usually gets brought into that picture as well. And usually some type of analytics, even predictive analytics, comes into this. And as I said earlier, it also goes by the name unstructured text analysis. So one definition I've found is that big data is a broad term for data sets so large or complex that traditional data processing applications are inadequate. So that's just the capacity side of that. It goes on to say the term often simply is the use of predictive analytics or other certain advanced methods to extract value from data. And so again, that's sort of where you read all different types of things, but that's sort of where it goes on that. So, which brings us right to the next slide. And if you're going to, one of those things, a couple of people said I'm not sure I could talk to my client about data analytics. If you're going to talk about data analytics, one thing you need to do is get comfortable with the 4 V's. So when people talk about data analytics, and particularly big data, the 4 V's come up. IBM's been credited with others about kind of churning that. And so I pulled this off the website, and it was publicly available. So I would encourage you to go in and look at their site to pull down this information. But this is sort of their way of, another way of defining big data. So it's kind of an abstract way of thinking about it. But it's situations where you have large volumes of data. You have a variety of data, so it's not from one place. It's usually when we're dealing with big data, we're bringing together. I mentioned earlier that we're pulling down petabytes of data every evening doing analysis here, and it's coming from a variety of sources. And again, because it's unstructured, we don't care where it comes from, and we get it from that perspective. There's a velocity, and that is just how fast the data is coming and availability. You know, as I shared some of the statistics earlier with you about how much is being created every day and the ability to be able to do that. And the veracity is one that we have related to, and they'll come up as a challenge in a minute, and that is some people don't trust the data. Okay, it comes from all different places. So what's the biases from that data? If you only, for example, if you pick up tweets or text messages or whatever, can you really make the conclusions that are made when you realize what part of the population uses those devices to communicate with? And so those types of things come up. But I like this picture. I suggested to you as a way for you to talk in your firm and to your client about big data and what the opportunities are in that area. Okay. So I came back to tools mainly to remind you, I'm sure you probably used one or more of these tools before. You probably used IDEA. By the way, I get no commission from any of these tools. These are just tools that I've used or I see other ones use as well. You've probably done journal entry tests where you've gone out and looked for amounts over a certain amount or have unique characteristics end in 999 or all zeros or something like that, or made at midnight on a holiday weekend. Maybe you use Binford analysis, which is a frequency distribution for leading digits that's often used in fraud detection. That's an area we find in there, or just general account analysis where you go into an account and you'll look for some unusual characteristics using the software to be able to detect those out. IDEA and ACL are both databases that have preset routines, or you can write them yourself that allows you to go in and look at data to try to find unusual trends and things to search farther. As I mentioned earlier, XBRL is more of a structured element, but you may have used XBRL to pull down maybe financial statements from several companies that are in the same industry, maybe as your client, and it's an effective way to be able to pull down the financial statements using XBRL, a way to compare the various financial statements, or even footnotes, because the footnotes are tagged as well. That allows you to be able to do that. So these are items that we're using. Okay, so these are all things, and these are all data analytics, and these are all beginning to get us into big data. So I just wanted to before I get into these examples, which I'm going to cover next, to remind us, hey, we're along this journey already. We're a long way here. So with that, I thought I'd talk about emerging trends, and particularly I have 2 examples I'm going to use to kind of, and they're kind of at opposite ends of the big data spectrum. So it was a reason I picked them to try to show you. And these, I have either worked with organizations or talk to organizations that are actually doing these types of examples. So before I get into examples, though, I think it's fair to kind of think about, if you think about the auditing standards and the places that we use information to make decisions, there's a variety of phases in the audit where we need it, from accepting the client to begin with, or deciding whether to continue as the client, trying to determine the risk and material misstatement between inherent risk and control risk. There's information we're using there, both internally and externally, trying to understand the entity and its environment, responding to risk and material misstatement, okay, which is really the procedures you use, to how you're using data analytics and big data to respond to the risks that come up. And at the end of engagement, how are you doing it? Can you use this information to be able to perform analytical procedures? And so there's clearly, I would say, as I look at it, there's many opportunities for big data to play in this variety of items. So this is sort of the what. We'll get to the how in a minute. But I also thought, that middle box there about responding to risk and material misstatement. Let me just share 3 examples, so maybe to get you to think about how this could work with big data. Historically, when we looked at warranty reserves, so warranty liability, you look for, well, what's the outstanding claims that have been made, and that's kind of way down the pike because the person has to make the claim. What happens instead is you went out and looked at social media, and found out what people were saying about a particular product, and the noise and the chatter that was out there to give you some indication. Well, there's a major problem coming down with this product line. Maybe people aren't into the recall, they're not there. It's clearly there's an issue with this product. So in essence, you're getting ahead of what you would normally have in this particular piece of information. Likewise, you could look for inventory obsolescence. You look at inventory obsolescence, you go out and look around and see if it's got dust on it, or you look for inventory turns, or you do various things to try to indicate for inventory obsolescence that's out there. But you could use big data to go out and look for industry trends. And again, maybe it's only a couple months ahead of time that you're seeing it versus the other way, but it gets you into the game earlier to be able to see emerging trends that are coming out, where you see a competitor has announced, a series of competitors have announced a product that's going to really knock your client's product right off the shelf. And to be able to anticipate that coming, instead of waiting for the slowdown to come, but actually see it coming, you can use information that's readily out there, public information, to be able to see that. Last example I wanted to share in that area was really RFID tags, which are many organizations now routinely have on their inventory. And so my challenge there is, will we come to the day where maybe you don't actually physically need to go out and examine the inventory, even though it is a current auditing standard, or can you use RFID tags to determine its existence, or if it's not existence, could you at least determine the accuracy, such as what is it, how many are there, descriptions, and that other type of information. So again, the challenge here is there a way to use the data that's being captured under RFID to be able to get some of the assertions that we have related to inventory. So those, again, just not overly complex. Maybe you're already doing some of them today, but just to try to give you an idea about that box about responding to risk material misstatement. What are the types of things that you can think about in that area? Okay. So with that, I'm going to go into our first example of what I've seen out there firms are using. And the first example is what I'm calling the 100% examination. This is the area that I would say, when I look across what the firms are doing, this seems to be I don't want to say the low-hanging fruit, but it is an area that a lot of organizations are currently looking at. And remember earlier when I went to the definition of big data, kind of one of the issues was just being able to process big capacity of information. So this does 2 things. The 100% examination allows organizations to significantly enhance the amount of information they're looking at, probably more efficiently and effective than they would do in a sampling. And it actually gets at our old bugaboo sampling risk. Looking at 100% of the population would significantly reduce sampling risk, if you think of it that way. Historically, what we've done in this area, we have sampled. We've gone out and we've pulled documents, and we've looked at some subset of the population, usually a very, very, very small subset of the population. Sample may be bigger than we want to look at, but it's still relative to the size of the population, are usually pretty small in what we're looking at. And so what I'm going to tell you is about how some organizations are using 100% examination to audit sales. And what they're doing is, it's the old 3-way match, where they're actually matching up the customer order, the shipping report, and the sales invoice for agreement. And so they're looking to the extent that they get all those in agreement, they have evidence that that sale actually took place. And in going through that process, companies, they're finding out, they're getting 97, 98% match, where you hear organizations are able to match those up, and they're compared that to your sample, which maybe 1 or 2% that you may have used out there before. But what they're also finding when they go through this is they're finding out, while they thought all sales were handled the same, they're finding out sales, when you start using computers to start matching documents, even in unstructured text, you find out things about the population you never knew before. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's different than you thought. And so what people are coming away with is insights of the population that they didn't know about before. And as an order, that's a good thing. It also provides us some challenges, which I'll get back in a minute. So one of the examples you're seeing, and this is where firms are just using the capacity that's available through the various applications. So they're really doing what they would have done in a sample. They're just doing it 100%. It's probably one of the best ways to be able to describe that. And again, it reduces sampling risk and feels them more comfortable. It is going to create some challenges, which I'm going to get to in a minute, about what do you do with that 2 or 3% that you didn't get matched. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in a very large population, it could be thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of transactions. So you have to sort of think about that 2 or 3% that you are unable to match up, which may or may not have errors in it. It just may be something you didn't understand about the population. So let me go to the other side of this, and then I'll come back to the challenges. Is that this is the predictive side, and this is where I'm seeing firms stick their toe in the water, but you're going to see an emerging trends. I think this was probably more going to be an emerging trends for several reasons. One is we're still learning an awful lot about it. I think there's a regulator play here as well, and the standard setter on this side as well that we have to kind of work through. The other thing is, where are you going to use predictive analytics? I think, at least in the short run, predictive analytics appear to be more acceptable to the auditor, at least in the assessment phase, the risk assessment phase, as opposed to I'm looking for hard evidence. I want to use this as my primary evidence to conclude as to the assertion of a particular account. I think that's still, I don't want to say problematic, but it's an issue that we're still kind of working through on that area. But I think other people say, well, I can use it for my risk assessment, I can use it to gain understanding. Most people will pick that up pretty quick, but they pause before they say, I want to use that as my primary evidence in an area. I don't think we're quite there. Okay? But the example I would use here is on a predictive analytics. Again, I'm going to use sales again, and that is being able to predict sales. And because of the capacity of the technology, we can disaggregate the data significantly. So we're not talking about sales and sales. We're talking about breaking sales down by geography, or by product, or by maybe how it's delivered, what type of restaurant or what type of retail outlet or whatever warehouse it may be in. And so you can take a lot of data and you can disaggregate it very quickly using big data, and that's from the financial. And then you can add healthy non-financial data, such as weather. Is the company's product affected by weather? Is the company's product affected by a competitor that moves into town? What about economic trends, population characteristics? Are there certain characteristics in the population that drive a particular product more than others? And your client is actually using a lot of these themselves, but over on the marketing side to drive. The question is, can you use the same information to be able to help you on a predictive side to try to predict ahead of time where you think these sales trends are having? And so the technology here allows us to have a variety of data that we hadn't had, this unstructured text that we've been unable to achieve before. It also allows us to put all this together in some pretty large data sets. The other thing that predictive allows us to do is move more from a causation type of analysis to a correlation, where we can actually get to a correlation as opposed to thinking about the cause. We can actually say, when this happens, we can expect something else to happen as opposed to a cause. And so an example of that would be, think about restatements. Think about if you could correlate restatements in such a way that if you could see some indicators in the financial statements, that would give you some indicators of how areas of restatements. So hopefully that would be an area that we can use that in as well. So those are my two examples. One is 100% examination, the other one is predictive, and I really think ultimately the predictive is where the money is, but we're not quite as far along as we are on the 100% side. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about challenges, but before we do that, Zach, I think we have one more polling question.
Absolutely. We have our last polling question, which I'm going to go ahead and launch. The polling question is, what challenges have you faced in using data analytics? How to design analysis, data integrity, and how to handle exceptions, client acceptance, and regulator acceptance. We're just waiting to get up to 70%, and then we're going to go ahead and close it. If you have any last-second submissions, go ahead and make them. Okay. Poll results. 35% say how to design analysis, 17% data integrity, 13% how to handle exceptions, and 13% client acceptance, and 22% regulator acceptance. Scott, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, it's a good mix, actually. I would clearly go with where the strong is with the 35%. I would expect that because if you can't get past that one, you're not going to see some of the other ones. And so I could see those people, particularly that are just getting new to it, probably design is really important. And so if you can't get past that, you're not going to get to data integrity. Actually, data integrity could actually be part of the design, depending on how people interpret it. So I think it's a fair representation. That actually the regulated acceptance is actually, I'll be honest, was a little higher. So that probably means some people have had some dialogue or some conversation with regulators about this, which I think is good. It's a good thing to happen. So thank you for that. Okay. So at this point, let me go into some of the challenges, and this is a way to get you to sort of think about your challenges, but there are things you need to think about. It's really to that question about design. And so while I put them in the categories changes there, they could be things you got to think about as you go down the route. Probably another way to put them in here. And 100% examination, I doesn't say is restricted to it, but historically it's probably more dealing with internal information, whereas predictive analytics has more of the external. But there's no reason that 100% examination has to be internal. It often is. The first one is design of analysis logic. And I mentioned earlier in that sales example, gee whiz, you got a 97, 98% match. That's great, but how do you know you designed that logic right? So one of the questions you have to be able to answer to yourself as well as to a regulator that comes in, whoever that may be, is, whether it's peer review or whatever, is that how do you know you designed that in such a way that those 97% are really matches? And so that's, you know, everybody was really quick to jump on the exceptions, but that's no different than an analytical procedure normally. But the question here is you've now got a 100% test, and this is, if you're going to do this, this is your primary evidence as opposed to a secondary test. So this ability to be able to feel comfortable that you designed your analysis appropriate to really get the match is really important. So, you know, obviously you got to do some tests of that and see how that works. Estimation and certainty or precision is another way. Is often a challenge. Can you, what are you going to do with these errors? And that's why I'm going to come back to that later as well. But can you design this, for example, when you design what it's matching or what it's doing or what it's looking at, can you do that in such a way that it meets the definition of materiality and is equal to or less than performance materiality here, so we can accept what you come up with. Population completeness. We always have population completeness and availability, but since we're looking at 100% of data, create some other challenges. And I mentioned earlier one of the skills that's being surfaced is the IT skills, again, to be able to do that. With subledger information, because you need it to be able to do this 100% type of matches and things, you need to be at the detail level. So, you know, sampling at the home office and summarized data isn't going to work. So that also gets to the population completeness. You have to get down to the subledger and division subsidiary level to get the details to be able to do these 100% matches if that's what you're going to do. Because summarized data is not where you're going to be able to do. Information overload, I mentioned earlier visualization, but the key here is you get a lot. Okay, you get a lot of matches, but you get a lot of matches, things that don't match. And false positives, as I mentioned earlier, you learn things about the population you didn't know. It doesn't mean they're errors, they're just things you didn't know about them. And so you got to be able to sort those through between the things you're finding that are just additional information you didn't know versus what is real error, and that's where the critical analysis and thinking comes about. And you got to have a higher, this ambiguity. Things are not going to be clean as you work with structured data, and it's just not going to be matched up that well. And so you got to over time get comfortable with that. We'll see how comfortable we need to get from a precision perspective to be able to do that. And the last one is exceptions and follow-up. They're not all errors. You will get conflicting information. It doesn't matter. I mentioned earlier, just a sheer number pops in here. Again, you're only talking about a couple percentage points, but you have very large populations, even a medium population, it's a lot of things to follow up on. People sort of look at that and say, what am I supposed to do with that? And so that's one of the real challenges that you may want to think through as you're designing, is how you're going to define an error and how you're going to follow up with those particular items. On the challenges on the predictive side, we have some challenges there as well, as you probably appreciate, as I alluded to. One is the data integrity. We are using a lot of non-traditional sources, so a lot of questions, if you read the literature on analytical procedures, you have to have comfort about where the information comes from, and you need to be comfortable about reliability. And so the next slide talks about sources of data, so the next two slides are related in this area, but we're dealing with non-traditional, so the reliability of that large. So the question that comes up is the fact you have such large data sets offset the fact that all the data may not be perfect? And so that's one of the things we're trying to work through, is just does the law of large numbers work here to the extent that you can get comfortable with the data, even though it's not perfect data. It won't be. The question is, can you live with it just because it is such large numbers and trends? Other is it representative? Again, this comes back to deciding where you're going to get information. You're getting information from social media. Is that biased because of people that are primarily more accustomed to using that? So you have to ask yourself that when you're structuring your information. Are you getting it from a representative population from that where you want it from? Emails. Historically, people use email, going into emails when it's more fraud-oriented, but I just want to drop a concept, or with what we have now, will searching emails become, particularly with non-structured text analysis, become more of the standard part of an audit, just a question, because we do have the ability to do that more. First of all, we have capacity to go through those emails, and second of all, we now have unstructured text analysis. We have the ability to look at items, and the fraud side's been doing that for a good little while, so maybe we'll actually get it more efficient and effective and cost benefit for us. Sources of data, that's kind of related to data integrity as well, is you often don't know the source of this data because you're pulling it off the internet. When you go in and pull files out of the federal government, it's public information. You look at economic data, construction, income data, things like that. That you have some reliability on that because you know where it comes from. It's not totally reliable even there, but it's more reliable than just going out on the internet and pulling down information. So is it complete, or the biases into it? Okay. But I think to look at the positive side of this, I think we can start exploring new sources of information to bring to the audit that we haven't had before. And to me, that's the exciting part of this, is the ability to bring in new data that we haven't had before to look at compared to the financial data to try to identify unusual transactions. Precision is another one. Can we design these tests to operate in such a way that we can get back to our performance precision that is equal to or less than performance maturity? I mentioned estimation uncertainty is definitely a play here when we're putting together these predictive analysis. Can we get it close enough that we're comfortable with it? So to be a primary evidence. Obviously, we can always use it to supplement other evidence, but are we getting to a point where we can actually use this as primary evidence? Another challenge is plausible relationships. It's one of the requirements of analytical procedures is plausible relationships, and sometimes they're not obvious. You know, when you use financial data and financial analysis, you would expect if sales went up and there had been no change in collection policy and the economy is pretty much stayed the same, you would expect receivables to go up in some like amount. That's a plausible relationship. But all types of different things come up when you start looking at non-financial data. You probably read the story about Walmart when they did their analysis of what's the most important product they need to have on hand before a major storm where the lights could go out and people lose power. It is, believe it or not, Pop-Tarts. That's the analysis they found out. That would not, you would think it would be generators and batteries and all the other stuff, but it was Pop-Tarts because it's something that can be eaten and doesn't need to be cooked. And so those are things you find out when you start looking at this information. Likewise, there was a analysis done with a construction organization where you would thought the sales would go up more after the storms than before the storms, but actually the analysis showed us that it could be up more because people were buying the stuff in anticipation of the storms as opposed to after the storm. So some of your normal relationships may or may not hold there. So then you have to think about what is an exception. And you may go in thinking it's one thing and it's something else, but again, is the error, what's the follow-up so you're not overwhelmed by the information that's coming out the back end? Can you decipher the errors from just the unusual relationships that you weren't aware about, and what are you going to do to follow up with those? And then how are you going to visualize it? This is if you've not seen this video, I've got the link here on the deck. I'd strongly encourage, it's only 4 minutes long, but it tells, it's the use of bubble charts to visualize. This happens to be trends in population and things, but I would encourage you to think about that because you get a lot of data and you got to be able to present it in such a way people can understand it. Just mounds of data isn't going to mean anything. But the problem with showing charts and graphs is how do you get to that precision, our good old friend precision that we need to be able to make that work as well. So that's an issue. So before I move on to regulator acceptance, I just kind of summarize, I kind of gave you an idea of where I see the traction currently going in 100% in predictive analytics. There's clearly some challenges there, opportunities if you want to look at it, but if you're going to go into these areas, these are the types of questions you need to be asking up front, seeing if you can solve as you go forward. That's the reason I kind of teed them up that way. A lot of regulators out there, and so the good news is I know a lot of them are looking at it. They're trying to figure out what the impact is. Do the standards need to change? Are the standards fine without it? What makes a good quality? Can you have a quality audit using these types of techniques? I don't think the answer has been decided on that, but I think I'm seeing some good movement on that area. So these are potential areas that I just tee up. So again, as you're thinking about going down this route, if I was you, I'd think about these things as you go about designing your procedures to see how you would answer these questions. If you're using the population's audit evidence, are you in circular logic? So again, if you're using the population itself to give you evidence about the population itself, and again, I think this is a good area for big data to bring in some non-traditional information to help you with that. How are you going to support the integrity of your data? One of the challenges I previously mentioned. How are you going to be able to support that, particularly when you go into predictive analytics and you're using data from non-traditional sources? Those will all big numbers help you there. It's the challenge. Can you design these in such a way that you get enough precision to fit in your performance materiality? That is a challenge, and so you need to be prepared to answer that question. The fourth category is, does this fit within the current definition of audit evidence? I know a lot of people say it fits on the analytical procedures, but I'm not sure it does. In the last bullet, some of it does, obviously, but I think the next last bullet on 100% versus sampling, if you read the standards are written from the perspective, it doesn't matter what regulator it is, by the way, of a sampling. There's an inherentness in the standards that assuming with sampling. There's an inherentness in the audit report that refers to sampling. And so the question is, do the standards need to be changed if you're doing 100% testing, examination? Are there additional risk or additional procedures or different things that need to be thought about when you're in 100%? And we do some 100% testing already, but it's usually in the stratification of a population. It's not the entire population we're looking at 100% unless it's a pretty small population. So kind of need to look at the standards from that perspective and say, do they need to be adjusted? And the last one is the use of unstructured data. I'm not sure the standards are written from a perspective of willingness. At least when I read it, it's very much written from a structured data perspective, particularly when you get to reliability of source of information. So let me go on to future application, and I think this is a promise, and I think this is why everybody's spending as much time as they are on this, is I think people are excited about where this can go. So let me just share a couple things with you. There's been a promise for a long time about continuous auditing. Some people use it, some people don't. It's been out there for a very long time. I think you can see from some of the things we're talking about that the real promise of continuous auditing may actually come to fruition here to have better error detection and reduced human error. So I really see this as probably accelerating continuous auditing. Clearly, as I've probably inferred earlier, I see predictive analytics significantly increasing. It's definitely not here yet, but it is an area that I know people are looking at and spending some time. And so right now, probably in the short run, it's going to be more in support of traditional audit evidence as to its sole audit evidence, and don't know what it will take to get it to the point where it will be the only piece of evidence for a particular assertion. But right now, it's probably more in support of. Not one I've mentioned, but increased collaboration is an area that often comes up with big data, and that is because of the skills that I referred to earlier. Technology skills, you may need to find a statistician to help you. Visualization, maybe find a computer science person that understands visualization. The data analytics skills. Other parts of your firm, you may have an advisory in your advisory people. I know a lot of the firms established advisory people that have data analytics skills that may be helpful in this area. We're beginning to do some work of tax. Tax is an area that data analytics is coming into, and we're doing some work there as well. So I think that's another area you may want to be thinking about. This is maybe a left turn in the middle of going right, but I also wanted to bring this up, is that the evolution of financial reporting. If you look out there, are we moving away from more static information to more raw data that can be extracted and examined? That clearly was the promise of XBRL. But I think companies are looking at more real-time reporting of information. This was back in the late 2000s, but we got distracted by the dot-com and the liquidity crisis in between. But I think companies beginning to think about other different ways to report information, and if that is, then clearly big data would be an area to report that or to even examine it, if you think about it from that perspective. And obviously unstructured text analysis. The data sources will get better, the analysis will get better, the skills will get better. I mentioned earlier the email. I think the ability to be able to go into email will be significantly enhanced because of that. And skills. The skills will get better. I mentioned earlier that we're doing a lot here, at least at NC State, to prepare our students for the future. So my question to you is, how are you going to use that? How are you going to use those new skills and they're sharp at your firm to be able to do that? From critical thinking, how to formulate the question, to identifying data sets, using the tools and software, dealing with ambiguity, and understanding visualization. So before I turn it back to Zach, I'd like to leave you. There is one caution I still have here, and I put a big circle around my notes on it, is in the short term, we sort of need to be careful that as we move down data analytics that we're not actually increasing the expectation gap that our users of the financial statements have. In our interest to go down and to do better quality audits, which is absolutely a goal that we all should have, we could also exacerbate the expectation gap with our users. So I think it's important communicating with our clients and users really what the capability of big data is. So with that, Zach, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much for your insight. So as we move over into our question and answer time, I really quickly wanted to run through a few StageWorks slides. ProfitCents is one of StageWorks' big data solutions, and StageWorks' main goal is to provide financial analysis solutions that help financial professionals streamline their advisory engagements. The value of ProfitCents helps accountants generate more leads, decrease client turnover, and create better client relationships. StageWorks aggregates the largest real-time database of private company financial statements via CPAs, banks, and credit unions. their industry data can be broken down and analyzed by NAICS code and geographic region. Additionally, the value to address your pain points that ProfitCents offers is that we understand that as accountants, your goals are to grow your client base, deepen client relationships, and gain opportunities to provide advisory services. ProfitCents addresses your needs with features that provide easy-to-understand narrative reports that diagnose the financial health of clients and help your clients understand where their business is at. Industry data that is used to expand firm services by using benchmarks that determine where clients fall short of industry standards. Additionally, projection tools to identify advisory opportunities where clients can modify cash flow and develop growth. Finally, in helping with audits, our analytical procedures tool is used to cut down on time performing audits, providing customizable thresholds to highlight areas for further investigation and increase profit realization. Additionally, I would like at this time to pose one last poll question, and we'll put that out there and you can answer that really quickly. Just a few more seconds and we'll close it out. Alrighty, thank you so much. And so now we'll be moving into our question and answer time. And once again, we want to say thank you so much to Professor Schulwater for spending his time with us and giving us some guidance. Since we're running a little bit over time, we'll just mainly focus on one of the questions that one of the attendees sent in, Scott. But the question is, how long does it take to onboard big data solutions? Is it worth it to onboard?
The answer to that question is it's got to be a long term. To me, you have to make an investment. The organizations I'm familiar with are looking at it as a long term. It's not something that you're going to do quick. To be honest, I think that's the nature of the question. But if you're looking at your practice and you're saying, do I want to use this? I think the payback is going to be there, so it's worth making the investment. But I do want to stress that it's more of a longer-term investment, if I'm reading through that question, Zach, as opposed to a short-term return. You're going to have to make an investment both in your people, your skills, and capabilities to be able to do that. I think all that's going to be necessary here because we're sort of at the bleeding edge of this. But I think the payoff will be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. One final question that actually was sent in to answer your question. Do you know how your clients are using data analytics? One of the attendees said that they're using data analytics to compare themselves to other companies in the industry. What's the next step for these companies as they're trying to use big data?
My experience has been is they're doing a lot of data mining for products and services, really trying to figure out trends and where they want to go, customer preferences. If I'm looking across, that's where I'm seeing it. Some of them are using it for intelligence against their competitors, and some of them are actually, believe it or not, are looking at for possible acquisitions, where they go out and they put out and they'll go out and look at the abyss and try to identify companies with certain traits they're looking for as possible acquisitions. So it's really all over the map. But probably the biggest thing I'm seeing is really trying to identify trends for product development.
Thank you, Scott. One of our attendees also is asking a question for a small business that uses his services. They were asking what are some basic analytics that they could use to kind of begin using big data analytics.
Well, I think in the short run, I would encourage more of what I call the 100%. No, with going out, searching for information and looking for a trend, as opposed to but the predictive is going to be the tougher side. So my advice, if you want to start, it's probably going out, spending some time thinking about what's the most likely sources of data, where data would be to be able to answer that question, and bringing it back and looking at it and trying to parse that out. That'd be my advice. But again, it's going to be hit or miss until you figure it out a little bit. Because one of the things we go through, as I said earlier, you got to learn how to ask the right question. That seems easy. It's hard. And so what you'll do is you ask a question, you'll go out and bring data back in, and by the nature of your question, you realize you got a lot of data you didn't need. and then you also realize some of the stuff you were looking for you didn't get. So you actually will go through the data analysis and that questioning 3, 4, 5 times before you actually end up with what I call a data set that you probably could do something with. So again, that comes with the time.
Thank you, Scott. And that's all the time that we have to do some question and answers here on this webinar. But your other questions that you sent in, we'll respond by email. But we finally just want to thank you for attending today's webinar, Using Big Data for Firm Success. And we also want to thank Professor Showalter for coming and putting on this wonderful presentation for us. If you would like some additional resources, you can go to our SageWorks website, ProfitCents website, or our LinkedIn or YouTube pages. Once again, we hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us.